Welcome back to Mystery Minds. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale of Tony the Ant Spilotro, a ruthless mob enforcer whose reign over Las Vegas was as violent as it was legendary. But his ambition came at a price, one that would seal his fate in the most brutal way possible. Las Vegas, 1986. The city is buzzing with gamblers chasing dreams, high rollers making million-dollar bets, and tourists mesmerized by the flashing neon lights. But for Tony the Ant Spilotro, the excitement of Vegas had long faded. He sits in a dimly lit coffee shop on the Strip, stirring a cup of espresso, lost in thought. His once powerful grip on the city's underworld is slipping, and he knows it. The walls are closing in, too many mistakes, too much attention. The FBI, the Gaming Commission, and even his own bosses in Chicago are watching his every move. Then comes the call. A simple message. The bosses want to see you in Chicago. For any made man in the Mafia, such a summons could mean only one thing. His time was up. It wasn't a request, it was an order. And ignoring it would be worse than obeying. Tony had spent years enforcing this very rule. He had seen men vanish overnight after getting called in, their bodies never found or discovered in shallow graves. He had carried out these hits himself, punishing those who had crossed the outfit. Now, it was his turn to play the role of the condemned. There was no escaping it. Running would make him a fugitive. Fighting back was impossible. His former allies were now his executioners. His reputation for violence, arrogance, and reckless ambition had made him powerful, but it had also made him dangerous to the very people who once trusted him. His younger brother, Michael Spilotro, had also been summoned. Michael wasn't a made man. He hadn't spilled blood for the mob, but guilt by association was enough. As they packed their bags for Chicago, an unsettling silence filled the room. Michael was nervous, but he had always believed he was untouchable. That belief had carried him this far, but deep down, even he knew. This was the end, a one-way ticket to Chicago. A meeting that wouldn't involve discussions, deals, or second chances. Just a cold basement, a circle of waiting men, and a punishment Tony himself had delivered to so many others. His final bet had already been placed. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the cards. Long before Tony, the Ant Spilotro ruled Las Vegas with fear, he was just another tough kid growing up on the streets of Chicago. Born into an Italian immigrant family, he learned early that power didn't come from words. It came from action. Tony was small in stature, but what he lacked in size, he made up for in sheer brutality. By the time he was in his teens, he was already making a name for himself in the city's underworld. Petty thefts, strong-arm collections, and enforcer work. He did whatever was needed to prove his loyalty to the Chicago outfit, the city's powerful crime syndicate. Loyalty was everything in the Mafia, and loyalty was earned through blood. In the mob's hierarchy, he started at the bottom as a soldier, the lowest level of a made man, someone who had taken the oath of loyalty and earned his place through violence. Soldiers followed orders. They carried out hits, enforced debts, and protected the family's interests. Above them were the capos, or captains, who oversaw multiple crews and reported directly to the top bosses. And at the very top sat men like Joey Aba, the boss of the Chicago outfit. But Tony didn't want to remain a soldier forever. He wanted more. His early work in Chicago showed his potential. He ran errands with Frank Carlotta, another young enforcer, and quickly became known for handling the dirty work no one else wanted. One of his most infamous early acts was the M&M murders, a gruesome double homicide that cemented his reputation. When two associates, Bill McCarthy and Jimmy Maraglia, crossed the outfit, Tony made an example of them. McCarthy was tortured with a vice until his skull cracked, forcing him to reveal Miraglia's location. Both men were later found dead in the trunk of a car. This kind of violence and efficiency made Tony a valuable asset. It also made him a target. The FBI, particularly Special Agent William Romer, took notice. Tony was young, aggressive, and completely unafraid of law enforcement. Despite growing attention from the feds, Tony's ambition never wavered. When the bosses needed someone ruthless to oversee their operations in Las Vegas, they knew exactly who to call. For Tony, this was more than an assignment. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to climb the ranks and become the king of Vegas. And he wouldn't waste it. When Anthony Tony, the Spilotro, arrived in Las Vegas in 1971, he wasn't just stepping into a new city. He was stepping into a gold mine. The Chicago outfit and other Midwest crime families had their hands deep in the Vegas casino business, skimming millions in untaxed cash before the government ever saw a dime. But keeping that operation running smoothly required a man with no fear, no hesitation, and no limits. That's why Tony was sent. His official job was simple: oversee Frank Lefty Rosenthal, the gambling genius running the mob's skimming operations from inside the Stardust Casino. Tony was supposed to ensure the money made its way back to Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland, quietly and without drama. But Vegas was different from Chicago. The rules weren't the same, and Tony had no intention of playing by them. Instead of sticking to his assigned role, he saw an opportunity to build his own empire. In a city built on greed, he found ways to take a cut of everything: bookies, loan sharks, drug dealers, and pimps. If someone made money illegally in Vegas, they either paid Tony or suffered the consequences. And the consequences were brutal. If someone refused to pay, Tony sent a message: beatings, broken bones, and sometimes worse. Baseball bats, bullets, and even meat hooks became part of his enforcement methods. The fear he created was so intense that many criminals preferred handing over their profits rather than risking his wrath. But as Tony's influence grew, so did the violence. The first 5 years of his reign saw more homicides in Las Vegas than in the previous 25 years combined. Bodies were turning up in the desert, and the once tightly controlled mob operations were now splattered across FBI reports and newspaper headlines. Even worse, Tony expanded into street crime, something the bosses back in Chicago never wanted. He formed a gang of thieves who targeted high-rolling tourists, pulling off smash-and-grab robberies and shaking down anyone foolish enough to flash cash. The Chicago bosses tolerated his reckless side business only because the casino money kept flowing. But as Tony's greed and brutality spiraled out of control, so did the heat on the entire operation. The FBI was watching. The police were cracking down, and the powerful men who had once backed Tony were beginning to lose patience. By 1981, Anthony Tony the Ant Spilotro was no longer just the enforcer overseeing Vegas for the Chicago outfit. He was a problem. His unchecked violence, street-level crimes, and growing ego had drawn too much attention. The FBI, local police, and even the Nevada Gaming Commission were cracking down, making life harder for the mob. Then, Tony made his biggest mistake. With his casino influence crumbling, he returned to his roots: robbery. He formed a burglary crew, later called the Hole in the Wall Gang, made up of seasoned thieves, including his brother Michael Spilotro, old friend Frank Colota, and trusted associates like Fat Irby Blitzstein. Their specialty? Smashing through walls to rob high-value targets. On July 4, 1981, they went after what they thought was an easy score: Bear's Gift and Home Furnishings, a store rumored to have large amounts of cash in a safe. Using thermal lances, torches, and brute force, they tried breaking in, but the heist was doomed from the start. The FBI was already watching. One of Tony's men, Sal Romano, had flipped and was feeding information to law enforcement. As the gang worked, an FBI SWAT team surrounded them. The once unstoppable Spilotro crew was now caught red-handed. Tony himself wasn't present that night, but it didn't matter. His empire was crumbling. After the arrest, the real damage began. Tony trusted the mob to protect him. He believed Frank Carlotta, who knew every dark secret, would never betray him. But when Carlotta learned that Tony had ordered a hit on him, he had no reason to stay loyal. In a devastating blow, Carlotta turned informant. The FBI now had an insider willing to expose everything: robberies, extortion, beatings, and murders. Tony's name was attached to more than 25 killings, including the infamous M&M murders. By 1983, Tony faced trial for those murders. But in a shocking twist, he walked free, not because he was innocent, but because the trial was fixed by a corrupt judge. Thomas J. Maloney, the man they once trusted to protect their interests, had become a liability. And in the Mafia, liabilities don't last long. By 1986, Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro was a man running out of time. The enforcer who once ruled Las Vegas with fear had become a liability to the Chicago outfit, to his former allies, and to himself. His reckless crimes, the hole-in-the-wall gang disaster, and the FBI turning his closest friend, Frank Carlotta, into an informant had brought too much attention. The bosses who once relied on him were now looking for a way to silence him. Then came the call, a summons to Chicago. Officially, it was a meeting to discuss his future. But Tony knew better. He had delivered these same invitations before. When the mob wanted someone dead, they didn't argue or send warnings. They simply called them in. His younger brother, Michael Spilotro, was also told to come along. Unlike Tony, Michael wasn't a made man. He hadn't committed the brutal acts that defined his brother's career. But it didn't matter. Guilt by association was enough. Despite the clear signs, Tony still went. Maybe he thought he could talk his way out of it. Maybe he believed his past loyalty would save him. Or maybe, after years of being the predator, he couldn't accept that he was now prey. On June 14, 1986, the brothers arrived in Chicago. They were told to meet mob enforcer Jimmy Marcello in a parking lot. From there, they were driven to a quiet suburban home in Bensonville, Illinois. But this wasn't a strategy session. Inside, a dozen men were waiting. Once the brothers stepped into the basement, there was no way out. They were surrounded. No guns, no quick deaths. The mob wanted to send a message. The beating was savage. Fists, boots, and baseball bats came down on them with ruthless efficiency. Bones shattered, ribs cracked, and blood covered the concrete floor. It was a slow, deliberate execution, just like the ones Tony had carried out so many times before. When it was over, the bodies were tossed into a shallow grave in an Indiana cornfield, sloppy burial that went against the mob's usual methods. They weren't meant to disappear. They were meant to be found. And in the end, the man who once controlled Vegas couldn't escape the one rule he had always enforced: betray the mob, and you pay the ultimate price. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most infamous crime stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mystery Minds. Stay tuned for more shocking true crime cases. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.